The 23rd of November, 1944, Allied troops liberate the city of Strasbourg in the east of France. 6 months after the Normandy landings, the people of Alsace can at last rid themselves of the Nazi symbols that have oppressed them for 4 years now. It has taken weeks of fighting, but the Germans have surrendered in the end. 2 days later, the tanks are advancing without difficulty, and an American patrol heads a little deeper into the countryside. Its mission is to reach the French village of Roto, 50 kilometers to the west, then to continue up the long slope of the mountain. For some months earlier, military intelligence obtained these photos. They show an unusual-looking group of buildings just above the town. When they get to Roto, the Americans start to climb the winding road through the pine woods. And this is what they find. 15 barrack houses that climb the hill, surrounded by electrified barbed wire and lookout towers.
They arrive at this totally deserted place. Nobody there. No more SS, no more deportees, not a single body left lying around.
No sign of life or of death. And yet it looks very much like these buildings have been the scene of crimes, out of sight.
This is a place where not just anyone's allowed to set foot.
There are cells. There are walls riddled with bullet holes, yet it's obviously not a prison. There's an anatomy table, empty coffins outside, just lying there. And above all, at the bottom of the camp, what looks like an oven. These GIs have just arrived in Europe. They don't know what to think.
The camp's discovered very early on. It's discovered at the end of November 44, so the American soldiers who arrive there don't know it's a concentration camp. For them, it's a real first. What on earth is this oven? What did they use it for? They've got all these questions in their minds, but absolutely no way of answering them.
What the GIs don't know is that they've just discovered, in France, the very first Nazi concentration camp in Western Europe. The first of a long and macabre line of them, but the only one that ever existed here in France. Natzweiler-Struthof, a name, however, that has meant hell for over 50,000 deportees from all over Europe. An open-air death trap at an altitude of 800 meters. Beaten by the freezing winter winds and baked by the heat of summer. Hidden away in the thick forests of Vosges, the SS have simply gone wild, beyond all imagining.
Life there was an unbearable frenzy of fighting to survive.
A camp to which fearsome SS chief Heinrich Himmler sent thousands of Nacht und Nebel, or night and fog, political deportees, all of them doomed to disappear without a trace.
You create a category that's suspended between life and death.
Jean Villeray is one of the last survivors. He's determined to keep on telling his story so nobody ever forgets.
It was one of the deadliest of the camps. They really just killed people for pleasure.
Ernst Sillum remained silent about it for many years, but he's accepted to relive his long-buried memories.
It's horrific, having to spend every minute just trying to find something to eat. It kills any other emotion.
Its job was to work people to death, but Struthof was a full-scale laboratory for Nazi doctors. One of them, just to create a collection of skeletons, even exterminated 86 Jews in a little custom-built gas chamber.
Obviously, it's sheer lunacy. That's what's so monstrous about the whole thing.
It's long been forgotten, but Struthof is the only Nazi concentration camp to have existed on French soil. And that is difficult to come to terms with.
It's hard to know you let it happen. You didn't protest enough. You never said, wait, you can't do that here in France. You just can't.
Why was this camp built here in a French forest? Who were the Nazi torturers who ran it? And what really went on here in this hidden place? Thanks to the survivors' testimony, but also to these drawings, remarkable documents that were the secret work of one of the inmates, we can now tell the chilling story of the Natzweiler-Struthof camp, one of the darkest episodes of France's history. It all began in June 1940. For several weeks, a firestorm had been raging over Western Europe. The Wehrmacht, the formidable German army, was sweeping away everything in its path. Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium, they all fell within a matter of days. France was struggling to resist. After the German breakthrough in the Ardennes, France's fate was sealed. On the 14th of June 1940, the Germans reached Paris. And 1 week later, Hitler forced the French army chiefs to sign an armistice in a forest glade near Compiègne. From then on, almost all of Europe was in Hitler's hands. France was divided into different zones. An occupied zone run by the Nazis, a so-called free zone that was under the Vichy regime, and the north annexed to the German command in Belgium. That left the Alsace-Moselle region, the borderlands that were so symbolic to both sides. Hitler took it, thus effectively annexing the east of France. Revenge for the humiliation of 1918. A defeated Germany had seen Alsace-Moselle confiscated, and at the time, for the young Corporal Hitler, that had been unthinkable.
It had always been one of Hitler's political ambitions to tear up the Treaty of Versailles. He was a veteran of the 1418 War himself, the First World War, and had lived through those years of a Germany in defeat. And the German people did indeed feel that this time the page had been turned on that shameful period of their history.
For Hitler and the Nazis, it seemed quite natural for Alsace to be back in the Reich. To make his point, the Führer went himself to visit Strasbourg Cathedral, along with all of his top brass. His plan was a simple one: to make the region German, but also, and above all, to turn these French citizens into Nazis.
Annexation is a very different thing to occupation. Occupation means that you keep your nationality of origin. Annexation, though, means you automatically become a citizen of the new country that's conquered you. Not the same thing at all. From that moment on, it's oppression and terror.
In just a few weeks, a leaden shroud had fallen over the region. The people of Alsace were all given new identity papers. Any sign of the French colors was removed from them. The French language was completely outlawed, along with any visible signs and symbols.
What first comes to mind is the classic French beret, which was now forbidden in Alsace. The Germans called it Geverdummungskappe, which means cap that clouds the brain.
The Nazi salute was made compulsory. Children were forced to enroll in the Hitler Youth, and their parents strongly urged to join the Nazi Party. On the least objection, they were sent to prison, to re-education camps, or across the Rhine to Germany.
And they just spread their remorseless terror all over the place.
The region was at their mercy, part of the Third Reich now, and like all the annexed regions, had to bow to the Führer's ambitions, as well as all his manias and follies. In September 1940, only 2 months after the annexation, prospecting began all over the region.
From the moment they'd annexed Alsace-Moselle, SS engineers would start doing what everyone in the Nazi Party was doing, exploiting the country they'd conquered.
The SS and their engineers, especially the geologists, were on the hunt for stone quarries.
For at that point, Hitler had embarked on a series of grand architectural projects. And to keep the Führer happy, one of his closest henchmen, Heinrich Himmler, had even created a special SS unit to do the work. It specialized in quarrying stone, and to do so used deportees from the very first concentration camps, who at this stage were mainly political dissenters.
The SS had a potential workforce right there in the camps. So there came a point where they said, why not make use of it? So they decided to have them do something they considered a particularly hard and thankless activity, working in the quarries.
Flossenberg, Grossrosen, Mauthausen. In 1940, the SS scheme had thousands of men working in the quarries at all these camps. But that still wasn't enough to supply the Reich. Especially since in the summer of 1940, what Hitler's architect really wanted was granite.
What they wanted was prestigious constructions, constructions that would last. So granite was the best thing for that.
So Himmler asked one of the geologists to find him some granite quarries in Alsace. Ones that would be in places where they'd be able to build concentration camps nearby. The geologist started searching around and found what he was looking for. In the commune of Natzweiler, up on Mount Louise. A vein of granite, but not just any granite, pink granite.
He immediately realized that the Nazis would be very interested in this, so he got straight in touch with his bosses to tell them what he'd found.
What's more, not even a kilometer away, there was a farm, an inn, and some outbuildings. A place called the Struthof.
It was a place they really loved in Strasbourg, the middle-class elite who liked their sports. It was where you went to have fun with your family, or for the lovely view, or to have a nice glass of Alsace wine at the inn.
In 1940, the Struthof was a little paradise in winter for people who wanted to ski or go sledding. In summer, it was an ideal spot for rambles. There was even a nice villa with a pool. But this peaceful resort was about to become an outpost of hell. Because for the SS, it was the perfect place for a concentration camp. The inn was ideal for the guards and the officers. The outbuildings could hold the first prisoners who'd build the projected camp out on the pastures. But it had other advantages too.
Down below was the direct railway line to the city of Strasbourg, so they could get their supplies in. It also meant they could bring in all the manpower that they needed. But of course, there was another reason: the relative secrecy of the place. It was nicely tucked away.
The SS quickly gave it the green light.
There were meetings with all the municipalities at Natzweiler, at Rotho, etc. The mayors were there, the mayors chosen by the Nazis, to hand over the land and to organize setting up the camp.
This letter shows all the deals that were made. It's dated the 14th of September, 1940, and is entitled The Granite of Vosges. The SS on-site representative informs Berlin that he has negotiated with the mayor of Natzweiler, who is ready to accept an offer for the occupation of this zone. An agreement could thus be reached for the SS enterprise to rent or buy the land. In the village, nobody was really in a position to stand up to the region's new master. In March 1941, Himmler officially decided to open a concentration camp on this land annexed from France. His objective? To send political opponents and resistors there. Not to reform them, to work them to death. And he gave it a name, K.L. Natzweiler-Struthof. So the order was given to the SS to hurry men to Alsace. Among the first to arrive there in the spring of 1941 was a certain Joseph Kramer.
He was a big man, very manly looking, dark-haired, with this big square chin. And you could see he was someone who was physically very sure of himself.
An admirer of Hitler and fanatic about Himmler, he'd been recruited to the SS in 1932. He'd been out of work at the time, unable to provide for his family. A situation the Reich was good at exploiting.
The Nazis were very cunning, because obviously if you give a job to someone who otherwise would be rather lost, that person will be all the more motivated.
He felt like a real man at last because, at last, he had a framework. He had the impression he was useful, and suddenly his life had a name to it.
Dachau, Mauthausen, Auschwitz. Kramer passed through a lot of camps and was trained by some fearsome SS chiefs.
When Kramer got to Natzweiler, he already had years of experience of the concentration camps behind him. And he was going to make his mark on this one.
For over a year and a half, he would oversee the laying of roads and the construction of the camp. Little by little, the camp took shape. Upstairs at the inn became the offices, the pleasant main house, the commandant's quarters, and on the ancient pastures, they built terraces to break the slope. And on each of those terraces, they built a block, one of them a prison, another a cremation oven. All around, a double row of electrified barbed wire fences 3 meters high. The whole of it surveyed by 8 watchtowers with views designed for perfect aim. Finally, a few barracks were built for the guards along the road leading up to the camp. In 1942, the whole area for kilometers around was made a restricted zone.
So the whole area was restricted to prevent anyone finding out just what a concentration camp really was.
Anyone who entered this restricted zone would be under threat of death, and everybody knew it.
At the head of his little concentration camp empire, Kramer made sure the arriving deportees got the message straight away.
The commandant, he was a right bastard, Joseph Kramer.
Ernst Sillem is 94. He's one of the 2 last Dutch survivors of Struthof. He spent 14 months there. When he arrived at the Roto train station just below the camp, a conversation he heard between the commandant and a guard left him in no doubt.
The first chap said, "There's one of them we really have to get rid of." And the other replied, "Don't worry, they're all going to be done in."
In another convoy, this one from Paris, was Jean Villeray. An equally frightening welcome awaited this 19-year-old member of the resistance.
As soon as we stepped out, all the yelling and the orders began. Schnell and all that. I didn't even know what it meant.
In the village, all the shutters were closed.
On the way up, I saw a woman crossing herself and another one crying. I was thinking, well, it's certainly not a holiday camp here, that's for sure.
The majority of the detainees were political opponents or young resistance members from all over Europe. They didn't know where they were or what was going to happen to them. But the men, or rather the phantoms, that they saw as they approached the camp chilled them. You can see it in this drawing one deportee did when the guards weren't looking.
That came as a very serious shock to them because they understood that those people were the image of what they'd be in a few months, or at any rate what the SS wanted them to be.
I never knew, never even imagined you could treat human beings that way.
Within hours, the deportees would be thrown into the total inhumanity that Kramer and his subordinates were orchestrating. The first big shock came right there at the entrance. They were all required to strip naked. The Nazis scrupulously noted down all their belongings to make them believe they might one day be able to leave.
Then they shaved you completely from head to toe. Not a single hair left. Then they take you into the next room, the shower room.
It all happened very quickly. As the minutes went by, it got more and more difficult to differentiate between all these naked bodies. And that was just what the Nazis wanted.
The ritual that the SS had come up with was really designed to break these people who'd been lawyers, tradesmen, citizens. It meant the SS weren't dealing with individuals anymore, just a mass.
To make that mass even more anonymous, the SS made the new arrivals all put on a striped uniform or old mismatched clothes. These would be their only protection against the cold.
They gave us clothes. You had to stand on tiptoe if you wanted to get big enough sizes that weren't too small for you. You just had to wear what you were given.
And finally, they gave everyone a number. 74 years later, Jean Villeray still remembers his.
I'm number 19410. These are things that you don't forget. It's a terrifying moment, being given a number. From that moment on, you were no longer a man, you were what they called a Stück.
A Stück, just a thing. Joseph Kramer wasn't the only one running this great grinding machine. He'd handpicked the most servile SS henchmen to do his dirty work.
These were men with no scruples. They were inhuman. They were bastards to everyone. They didn't know how to be good or kind. They didn't know the meaning of kindness.
Particularly Wolfgang Süß. The prisoners all called him the Creature. He was at the very heart of all the terror. There, cut off from the outside world, he could give free rein to his sadism.
People have testified to scenes of unimaginable brutality. People beaten to death, savaged by dogs, lying in puddles as guards urinated on them. Just atrocious things.
Torture was something that, where physical abuse was considered entirely normal to get people to obey.
As well as the SS, deportees had the capos to deal with too, prisoners who'd been promoted to oversee and keep an eye on their fellow inmates, and who had the power of life and death over them. Kramer had chosen them from among the first arrivals. It was a particularly cruel system.
This capos system was incredibly perverse, but very representative of the Nazi way of thinking. Because by turning some of the deportees into SS collaborators, they effectively turned them into torturers.
Torturers who made survival at the camp completely arbitrary, day after day, and night after night. For at Struthof, the days were an unbroken chain of suffering with one sole objective: to break both body and soul. Every day the men were woken at dawn and sent off to forced labor. The quarry was only a kilometer away. Under escort, the deportees all climbed the hill to that vein of pink granite that was so dear to the Reich. For 10 long hours, they would quarry the stone out of the rocks with nothing more than a pick and a shovel.
It was hell. People got hurt. There were lots of accidents. There aren't any better ways of showing your power over people than having them break up stones without even knowing why they're doing it.
Especially when those men are completely unprepared for such work. Just months before he was arrested for trying to flee to England, Ernst Selim was an agronomy student living a comfortable life with his parents and family. Natzweiler came as quite a shock.
It was especially hard on your hands, because you had to pick out the rocks with your bare hands, and they were sharp. You had to chuck them into the cart, into the trolleys there. There was a rock that fell on these chaps who were digging under it. One of them died straight away. 2 others died later. There were broken legs. It was right next to us.
They often had to work in conditions that would shorten their life, so there wasn't any thought for their working conditions at all. It was all about just exploiting their labor on the spot.
And never mind if it did turn out to be poor quality granite. The point of the camp was to work deportees to death. So the SS found another way to do that. A new activity. They had workshops built on the quarry where they had the inmates dismantling and repairing airplane engines all day for the German Air Force.
We were slaves. It was well-organized slavery.
They were worn out and exhausted, but their daily grind was far from over. For twice a day, they still had to face the ordeal of the roll call. Out on the terraces in front of the blocks, they had to stay on their feet till the Nazis had finished counting them.
You're tired, it's raining, it's snowing, you're cold, you're hungry, and you have to stand there without moving, without talking. The roll call was endless.
You just hoped the head count would be successful and no one missing, because then they'd leave us standing there all night, if needs be, till they found the last missing man.
Some just dropped during roll call. Their stomachs were empty or they were just too weak. They were beaten till they stood up or they were left there to die, but the head count had to be done.
For the SS, it was the occasion to make announcements to the assembled inmates.
For the SS, it was a marvelous stage to put on their show of power and of domination, as well as to assert themselves over the inmates.
When you take a whip and crack it in someone's face, so it leaves a scar, you're not only attacking that person's face and their very humanity, but you're also branding them in the same way a farmer brands a herd of cattle.
One evening, because he'd tried to get away from the drudgery, Ernst Selim was beaten up.
That's when I was beaten up, out cold. And when I came around, I had no idea who I was, who anybody was. My memory had gone completely from being knocked out.
The other inmates just had to stand by and watch.
We were watching, thinking it could be us. That's why you had to be very careful. You had to be alert all the time. Really, we had nothing at all. Our hands were tied.
The next day, Ernst was put back to work, despite all the pain and exhaustion he was feeling. The more time went by there on the mountain, the more their bodies grew weak. Even in the very worst weather, even when they were frozen stiff by the snow and wind, Kramer and his men gave them almost nothing to eat.
A snack in the morning, bread in the evening, soup at midday, which was pretty much just water with some bits of carrot or swede in it.
People in the concentration camps were treated a lot worse than domestic animals would be.
No meat, a hunk of bread a day, and a few grams of margarine.
It's horrific, having to spend every minute just trying to find something to eat. It kills all other emotions, and the feeling of hunger is just terrible.
At night, on the plank beds they were crammed onto a dozen at a time, the hunger never stopped.
It was awful. I dreamed of a banquet. I woke up from hunger. When you woke up, you were hungry straight away. Hunger never stopped.
So a 19-year-old man who weighed 70 kilos when he got there is only 35 or 40 kilos within 2 months. He's just skin and bones.
The daily soup was made here in this shed at the top of the camp. To distribute it down to the blocks, they had to go down all these stairs carrying the huge vats.
One day, one of the vats got spilled on the terrace, and there were inmates throwing themselves on it to lick up the soup and eat all the tiny bits from it as if they were animals. They had been reduced to that.
Normally, you go through life as an animal who's covered with a sort of skin of civilization. Well, that skin of civilization wears off bit by bit when you're hungry all the time.
Starving, reduced to slavery, the deportees of Natzweiler were also sent off to other commands. Gradually, a network of camps was springing up. It was impossible for the locals not to notice the columns of shadowy inmates, not to see them being hit and insulted.
They were in a very delicate position. They definitely couldn't complain about this sort of thing going on at the time, for fear of themselves being the victims of terrible reprisals.
Down below, silence reigned, while up there the infernal machine kept on killing. And there in his villa, 200 meters from the camp, Kramer cynically ran it all like clockwork.
He was doing his job, conscientiously, unthinkingly, with no regrets. It was a job. It started in the morning and finished at night.
Just a job. This horrific post, but one shared with the 250 SS men in total who worked here, in the one and only concentration camp in annexed France. The only photos to have been found show them all relaxed and smiling at the bar of the inn, and in complete denial of the barbarism they were inflicting on the camp.
They did their 60 hours or more on duty, and when it was done, they thought about their day off, their loved ones, their next family outing, or their holidays.
Some of them even took time to draw flowers on the letters they sent to their wives back home in Germany. Some commemorated their days at Struthof with class photos.
There's this thing called compartmentalization, which means you can do something in one place, then when you leave that place, you behave entirely differently.
Behind the smiles, though, these men were up to their necks in mass murder, protected by their uniforms. And what made them so ruthlessly efficient was the chain of command. At the least sign of weakness, they were off to the Eastern Front. They lived permanently under that threat.
If you were efficient and seen to be so, you stayed. But if you weren't, or if you made a mistake, you were sent to the Russian front.
The majority of them were happy enough to do their job as political soldiers at a camp where they were warm, well-fed, and their lives weren't at risk.
Especially since, on the front, things were getting complicated for the Nazis. It was 1943. The camp would soon have been running for 2 years. To the east, German troops in Russia were in retreat. To the west, the Allies had a foothold in Sicily. In the occupied countries, resistance forces constantly threatened the stability of the Reich. The number of arrests was growing, as were the convictions. But surprisingly, those convicted weren't being shot.
It was actually counterproductive, since the people who were executed, the resistance, often became heroes, role models for the people, and Hitler really wanted to avoid that happening.
So to terrorize the population, the Reich preferred to deport them in the greatest secrecy, and to create a new status, that of Nacht und Nebel, or night and fog prisoners.
From the moment they were arrested, the families of these people couldn't have any news of them, couldn't know where they were, who was responsible for them, or where they'd been deported to. You create a category who are suspended between life and death. They just disappear. No one knows if they're still alive or if they're actually dead.
NN for Nacht und Nebel. 2 letters that spelled a fate worse than death for over 2,500 deportees to Natzweiler, starting in the summer of 1943. At the Roto railway station, down there below the camp, the convoys kept rolling in now. From Norway, Holland, Belgium, France. Almost every day the wagons brought in new inmates. The SS were getting ever crueler, ever more bestial. When they got to the camp, the NNs understood right away the treatment reserved for them was going to be even worse than that of the other inmates.
For a start, they'll have a clear mark on their backs, a red cross daubed on their clothes with the letters NN under it, so they can be easily identified by everyone at the camp.
They're not only marked men, but they're cooped up, too. They're not allowed to mix with the other inmates, so they're put in a special block.
Cooped up in barracks 12 and 13, they were obvious and visible targets for the SS guards and their dogs. Kramer was determined to make them suffer before they died.
You might get out one day, just possibly, but damn it, you'll leave here in such a state that you'll show the others. They'll see from the state your bodies are in just what it means to defy the Third Reich.
There was one SS guard who really had it in for them. His name was Franz Ehrmantraut. He was 33 years old and head of the block.
He was one of the meanest. He'd keep hitting them till they were dead. It was atrocious.
He really let himself go with the first convoy of French NNs who arrived on the 9th of July, 1943.
So Hermantraut would force this group of Frenchmen to carry these blocks of granite up and down the steps of the camp all day, while being beaten with sticks by the SS and barked at by their dogs.
They kept carrying those blocks until they dropped. But as long as there was one man still standing, it just carried on.
The next day, out of 56 men on that convoy, only 8 were left alive. For the NNs, the ordeal would last for months. Always condemned to the most arduous tasks, shut up in cells, or 2 by 2 in cages only a few centimeters square, or simply killed for pleasure. The camp was getting crowded now, and some inmates were thinking about escape. A suicide mission given how isolated the camp was. When they were caught, they were immediately put to death by hanging. Kramer was there in person, smoking his cigar.
We just thought, well, he was unlucky, too bad. We knew that you often ended up dead. It's incredible how you get used to anything.
You also got used to the acrid smell of the crematorium, every day burning more bodies.
We were a bit hardened to all that. You had to be. You needed to be tough to keep going. Anyone who gave up hope, well...
Struthof was a place where you died through the cruelty of the SS, through work and hunger. But some also died in the name of science. Three doctors from the Nazi University of Strasbourg were coming to the camp regularly to carry out experiments on the inmates. 3 top doctors, all recruited by the SS.
These weren't monsters, madmen, or imbeciles. They were very learned men who, between 33 and 39, had been known at universities around the world.
They were all very well versed in medical developments in their respective domains.
Their mission? To protect both German soldiers and the Aryan race. For at the time, the Reich needed to speed up its research on the various dangers their troops were facing, such as typhus and chemical weapons. Natzweiler was obviously the ideal place to carry out human experiments.
They're in the ideal place there because a concentration camp's always a closed environment you can't get out of, so nobody can talk. It's perfect.
The experiments took place behind these windows, just a few meters away from the oven. Dozens of deportees were used as guinea pigs and died in appalling pain on these very beds, all their skin burned off, asphyxiated, without the least compassion on the part of the doctors.
They were just cases to those doctors. It was obvious they were going to die from those operations, but all the doctors cared about were their case studies.
These people were no longer capable of emotion. They had been trained to think of them as just enemies of the Reich.
One of the 3 doctors stood out from the rest, August Hirt. Severely facially injured in the First World War, a fervent SS man, and now professor of anatomy at the Nazi University of Strasbourg. Like his colleagues, he gave lectures in the amphitheaters, but from time to time, he'd head off to the concentration camp. Kramer never questioned it. In the spring of 1943, though, he received a very particular request: to transform a corner of the outbuildings opposite the inn into a gas chamber.
So they made it into a totally airtight gas chamber. A little gas chamber, one that would only take 20 or 30 people.
The anatomist was cooking up a diabolical project. In this letter sent to the highest authorities, Hirt and one of the others point out that we have many collections of skulls from almost all the different races and peoples, but that there are very few specimens of skulls from the Jewish race that would allow us to reach precise conclusions. This was an urgent matter for Hirt because all the Jews in Europe were being exterminated. Before it was too late, he wanted to get his hands on some Jewish skulls, or even whole skeletons, so he could study the bones and exhibit his collection.
He wanted to conserve Jewish bones, just like mammoth bones in a zoological museum, to show those future little Aryans that this had been a doomed race that threatened their very existence.
His project won the backing of Himmler himself, who was obsessed with research on race.
It was all a total delusion, one that came from a visceral hatred of Jews as a sort of anti-race.
So the SS anatomist was provided with everything he needed, even if it meant bringing in living Jews from the other end of Europe.
It was completely mad. Hirt was in the west of the Third Reich, and he was demanding this from the extreme east, thousands of kilometers away.
For Auschwitz in Poland was the only extermination camp where the Nazis applied selection on arrival of the convoys, and Hirt needed intact bodies in good condition. Thanks to the ruthlessly efficient Nazi bureaucracy, though, transport was arranged for 86 Jews. They all, men and women, arrived at Natzweiler after a 1,200-kilometer journey from Poland to France in August 1943.
Of course, their arrival, especially the women, since this was an all-male camp, was really something for the other inmates.
I remember there was this shed up at the top of the camp. We weren't allowed to communicate with it. And that's where they kept them. We had no contact.
At nightfall, the first group was taken down 1.5 kilometers to the special annex there. They were made to strip, then herded into this gas chamber. 14 women were shut in there. Hirt wasn't there. Kramer took care of the gassing in person. Through this grill, he watched every stage of it.
He was there and saw it all. Why not? He was just doing his job, making sure it was done properly.
Later, Kramer would explain.
I felt no emotion doing that. Anyway, it's what I was trained to do. So it was just routine for him. He didn't have a problem with it.
And he repeated the whole operation for 3 more days. Their bodies were transported to the University of Strasbourg, taken down to the basement, and plunged into vats. They would stay there for months. But Hirt never got around to his collection. Because in the summer of '44, Strasbourg was bombed. The Allies were steadily advancing from east to west. At the Natzweiler camp, the tension was mounting.
They realized they were caught in the middle of a pincher movement.
For some of the SS, the prospect of losing all their power, their uniform, their salary, created a kind of frustration or panic. And they compensated for that with enormous violence.
Under pressure, the SS flew into a rage. On the 1st of September, 107 dissenters and 35 resistance fighters were executed in a single night. All night long, the bodies burned in the oven. The next day, the order arrived from Berlin to evacuate the camp. For those inmates still left alive, it was the start of a deadly migration. a retreat to Natzweiler's sister camps across the Rhine, or to Dachau. There, many of them would catch typhus. Some of them clung on to life, though.
I'm sure there was something that allowed me to still be here today. Everyone who was in the camps and got out is a miracle.
It was at Dachau, 8 months after they left Natzweiler, that the deportees were liberated by the Americans on April 29, 1945.
Everyone remembers that date. It was the end for us, the end of the war.
Joseph Kramer was arrested at the Bergen-Belsen camp in Germany. He was condemned to death for the murder of thousands of Eastern European Jews, but would never be tried for his crimes at Natzweiler. Several of the camp staff and guards were brought to trial in France, among them the creature Süß and the sadistic Ermantraut.
It was only from those trials that we learned of the true horror of Struthof. And we learned of it gradually, just as it was only gradually that the French people learned of what had actually happened in France.
Although sentenced to terms in prison, the majority of them would eventually be granted remission and freed, as were two of the doctors who'd gone crazy at the camp. They resumed their careers in Germany. As for Hirt, he killed himself soon after the war. The story of Natzweiler remains largely untold to this day, eclipsed in our memory by other camps, other tragedies. And yet, of the 52,000 deportees who passed through Struthof and its sheds, nearly half of them never came home. The camp is still there to bear witness to their suffering, and so that visitors can remember all those who were lost.